Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name is Adam Hanlon. I'm new to Wetpixel, and we'd like to thank Icolite for sponsoring this episode. Icolite do a huge range of housings for almost every camera, ports, obviously, to suit those, arms, strobes, and other accessories. Please go and check them out at icolite.com. I'm joined, as not as always, because always, and I'm very thrilled to be joined again by Alex. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Adam. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. And what I thought would be an interesting topic to talk about today was how do you prepare your images for publication, Alex? What do you do to your images if you're going to submit it to a magazine or a stock library or so on and so forth? I thought that would be an interesting place to start. Really.
I think it's a really good question and a thing to dive into, because all underwater photographers know that processing images is an important part of our workflow. But actually, and we all know, lots of tips and tricks for getting the most out of the files, which are important to do. But I think one of the differences is that when you share your images online, they're seen at low resolution. When you show your images off as your own prints, or you show your images off to friends, you're often standing there and you can tell them that this was a particularly difficult situation. This was this, that, and the other. When you supply your images to magazines, to stock agents, and those images then go off, they don't have you there with them saying, "Oh, well, actually, this is a really rare subject, and I was lucky to get this." They need to stand up for themselves to someone who is going to look at them very critically, particularly in terms of how they're presented. And I think as a result, it's really important that you have a really solid workflow. And then there are questions, ethical questions as well, relating to that, as in, have you behaved correctly around the animals, and have you processed the image in a way that is not deceiving to the viewer? We have amazing tools, like sky replacement to drop different backgrounds in. We can clone things out of pictures. We can add them in incredibly easily these days, in fractions of seconds. We've got subject selection, processing, which allows us to instantly pick out a subject and make it stand out from the background. But we can also easily use those tools too far. And we've also got, tools like super resolution and noise reduction, which again, can really, completely change what was shot to what's presented. And I think all those things are things photographers need to think about. And I was going to use to guide this discussion some submission requirements that I saw recently from a specialist photo agency, which I think gives a really good guidance to what is expected of you as a photographer when professionally processing images that you won't be there when to defend. They have to stand on their own 2 feet as an image. And I thought it was just that would make a really interesting discussion. I'll read little excerpts out of it, and we can discuss them. It's divided into a few sections. There's a little bit on captioning, a little bit on ethics, a little bit about model releases and property releases. Property releases not so. I'm not going to cover that in underwater photography. Then a little bit about processing the files, and it's more of a don't do this list than a do this list. We all want to get the most out of those raw files, but there are things not to use. And then just a little bit about the sort of things that libraries are expecting these days. I think that a lot of us are shooting very high resolution cameras, but actually that's not essential. I think it's very important to remember that actually some of the older cameras produce image quality that's more than adequate for most printing needs. And it's not all about you've got to have an 8,000 pixel image for it to be usable. And but I think overcropping images is also quite a big problem, and a lot of end users, particularly magazines, would much rather be doing a bit of cropping at their end because they want to be able to fit it into their layout than actually. I think if you're cropping all your pictures in an Instagram style, they probably don't work very well professionally. So let's dive into this document, and I'll read a few little things out. The first thing that I think was quite nice or quite interesting is that this document, mentions to new photographers to the agency that they want to check that you're processing in the right way before. So they've taken you on because they've seen your pictures, and they're like, wow, you've got amazing stuff. But early on, they want to check that you are processing the pictures correctly, because you can't really tell from someone's pictures on Instagram whether they're actually butchering the image quality out of them, but they look great on, on a phone screen. But
Yeah.
actually, you put them on a piece of paper and they look rubbish.
Yeah.
So they actually say that they want that with a new photographer. They ask them to process 12 pictures as high quality full res TIFFs and send those in, and send with them the original raw files that they came from. And I
Yeah.
think that just gives them an idea of, to make sure that you are doing stuff. It's not a situation that if you've had to do this and that to make the picture look good. That's not necessarily against the rules, but they want to check that you're getting the most quality out of those raw files, rather than pushing them around to make them look impactful, but maybe not have the quality in them.
And I guess there's also the element that if, that by having the original raw file, they're actually checking that your fundamental techniques are sound. So, if people often can get away with sloppy technique,
quick and dirty processing.
Quick, yeah, but no, they can get away with sloppy technique by masking it by being really good at editing.
Yeah, and I think
and I think having the raw files on hand will allow the agency to go, well, actually, you need to work on your technical photography skills, and bring those up, because the processing skills are what's buttressing your ability as a photographer.
Yeah, and it's I think also agencies, their reputation. It's not just your reputation that goes out when they send the pictures, but if someone generally pictures are chosen with relatively low res, preview images, if when the high reses arrive, they're not up to standard for the printing, that reflects badly on the photographer, but also on the agency. So the agencies are keen to make sure that all their material is good. And obviously, if it's you working without an agency, just direct to a magazine. Again, a magazine sees your pictures on Instagram, goes, wow, we'd love to feature those in the issue. You send them in, and people are very disappointed. And, there's a very well-known old story in underwater photography. I'm not going to furnish it with names, of a very well-known photographer who's, was asked by a magazine to send their original slides in, which were famous from their books and places. And the magazine wrote back and said, please, can you send the originals? These are rubbish. And they were the originals. It was just they were so used to seeing them cropped to within an inch of their life, they hadn't realized quite what the originals were. And that was, in the film era. So the captioning, I think, is probably the most boring, but it's probably quite a good place to start. Is that it's hard to, people won't find your pictures in a stock library or on your own material without having proper captions in them. And the sort of captioning that both you and I put in our images is kind of like this: is that if your subject is marine life, you need to identify it, and you need to identify it correctly. It reflects very badly on you, on the publication that uses your picture, and the agent that supplies it professionally, if everyone publishes the picture and then later on everyone discovers it's the wrong, you've got completely the wrong species. I know species change names, and I think that's less of an issue over time if you've got an old picture with the wrong name on, and you obviously want to get that up to date. But I think most of the time people will at least, what's important is you've correctly identified something, and you've hopefully used the current name if there has been a name change. And just to understand the format of that, those that aren't used to scientific names, your genus name and your species name should be in italics, and the genus name should have a capital. Your species name should not. If you come from a scientific background like me, that being wrong is like someone dragging their fingernails down a blackboard. It just, you can't look at it. It's my wife, who I'm getting in trouble for this one. My wife, who is not a biologist, although she works in conservation and ecology, but her training is not a biologist. She will not always italicize her Latin names in text, and she always, so if she asks me to check an important piece of text, I'm always like picking her up on this. And she's like, yeah, but we're using it as a common name in English. And I'm just like, I can't get over that. So anyway. Okay, then I think it also asks you, sorry, I've got really sidetracked. Location is really important. People want to know where pictures are from. So, tagging, nearest city, country, region. And I always make sure I tag national parks in my captions, because I want to support the fact that pictures, beautiful pictures are taken in areas that people are trying to preserve. So I'm always very keen to put that in. And then I also tag in sea areas. So, I've just been in the Red Sea, so I'll tag that. I might be tagging Gulf of Suez, or I might be tagging Strait of Tiran. I might be tagging, in addition to Red Sea. So that part of my description is a land-based description. So a picture taken in the Red Sea might be, Sharm el Sheikh, Sinai, Egypt, but it will also have Red Sea and Strait of Gubal or wherever, and maybe a reef name. I don't tend to put dive site names into descriptions because a lot of them are silly. And if you have to tag in, Shark Corner or Shark Reef, then all those pictures will erroneously come up under a search for sharks. So generally, I avoid dive site names.
I think it's worth mentioning as well, just boiling it back down to basics. So this information needs to be added to the image's metadata. So this would be in some kind of metadata editor, probably Lightroom, but if you use a different type of software, you'd be adding this into a metadata editor. It's not something that you add as a file separate to it. It's something that you embed within the image.
Into the IPCC data of the image, and then it stays within the image.
Yeah.
And you're also adding your own name and that sort of thing into that as well.
Yeah.
A couple of other things they say here is that they want you, if the timing of the picture is important, not so much tropical work, but for temperate work, the time of year is really good to mention in the photo. I know it's in the data of the photo, but if the time of year is important for a photo, it's really good to, just to write at the end, photographed in June or whatever.
Yeah.
If you've done, it says here, if the image has been cropped more than 20%, mention it, because it's useful for the end user to know that they're dealing with an image that's been cropped. They might want to have the full version of it, to have if they need a bit more space on the page.
Yeah.
If you have got a model release, it's good to mention it in the caption. If you have done any processing that goes beyond it's very important to mention that. There's actually a really good thing it says about ethics below this. It says skepticism and mistrust hover over the photo industry, which I think was rather good.
Yeah.
And it's because it's so easy to doctor an image, and we all know what tools we've got for doing that, both in Lightroom and in Photoshop these days.
Yeah.
It's also with natural history subjects. There are many images that are around that have been staged. Not many, but there are plenty of images around that have been staged. All use captive subjects, not so much underwater with captive subjects, but on land. And I think it's really important that photographers are very open about that. So the caption is a great place to declare any unusual control situations. Baiting is good to, because so any of my shark dive pictures or stingray pictures, I will say, bait was used in these pictures if it was. And if it's a location where the animals are regularly baited, like Stingray City, when we go to Stingray City in Cayman, we very rarely use bait. But I always comment on the pictures, this is a site where the animals are habituated because of regular use of bait, even though none was used in this particular situation.
Yeah.
And that just enables the end user to know what they're dealing with.
Yeah.
Very rarely do the magazines, include that information in the caption.
Yeah.
But you're being honest with them, and then they can decide if in their use that's needed, or actually the nature of the thing works that. I think also it says here, if you alter the reality of the scene by cloning out or adding in extras, it's important to say that. So, I will quite often have a great wildlife image that's got an annoying diver in the background or something, or a fin tip in the corner of the frame. I'll say, diver's fin cloned out of this picture. And I'll usually put manipulated semicolon, diver's fin cloned out of the picture. So I've just been honest and straight. It almost never stops any usage, the image, but you're just being honest in that. And there is actually the NANPA, Photographers Association, has actually got this truth in captioning document for photographers to follow as well, which can be worth looking up. Model releases, I think, are something that we don't tend to deal with that much as underwater photographers, because we're photographing often unrecognizable divers. I generally, if I photograph people a lot, an individual a lot, I'll make sure I've got a model release. And of course, if I photograph, people who are children, I'll do the same. The main child I photograph is my own, so I can sign my own model releases for Isabella. And when she's older, she can argue about them with me.
Demand a share of the royalties. That's the problem.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll say, when I'm no longer here, she can have a share of the royalties. I think the stuff about processing is really, really important. Is that this is the quote that kind of sums it up. Unfortunately, we are increasingly seeing inappropriate or unnecessary use of noise reduction, sharpening, and image rescaling software, resulting in images being rejected by the library and also by clients. Um, Please be wary of over reliance on automatic camera functions and also post processing software, as we do not wish to reject otherwise excellent images based on software misuse or software peculiarities. And I think that's something that I think a lot of underwater photographers fall foul of.
Mm.
They know how to make their images look good, particularly for social media. And then when they suddenly start having to supply high res images,
Yeah.
both to magazines or to agencies, they fall foul of these things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I completely agree with all of this. I mean, if I was with this particular library, I would have to adhere to these rules. But I think that actually noise reduction can be important in some underwater pictures. Our pictures tend to show noise at much lower ISOs than land photos do because our backgrounds tend to be very monochromatic.
Yeah.
So they're very much single channel backgrounds, and
Yeah.
therefore the noise comes through much earlier.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we maybe need to be aware of. We can't use the high ISOs as easily as land photographers or as freely,
Yeah.
depending a lot on the camera.
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, here is a very interesting comment. It says, strictly speaking, sharpening should only be applied by the clients. So this is from the library's point of view, when the required size of reproduction is known. I would say that underwater photos taken through dome ports, taken through water, benefit from a small amount of low-level sharpening after the raw conversion, or as part of the raw conversion. And I will usually do that. But yes, I don't think you don't want to be sharpening a picture that you're sending to a magazine to the level that you would when home printing it. Yeah. I think that's kind of the main message is less sharpening is good, so that the end user can sharpen in the layout in the magazine.
I think some of the algorithmic sharpening that's going on now, there are programs and apps out there that will sharpen algorithmically. And whilst I think they're good, I think that you've got to be very careful with them. And I think that maybe the same is true some of the denoising algorithms as well. I think in Lightroom with the slider moving the sharpening around a little bit is acceptable, I'm sure. But I think when you take it out into another app and it then applies some kind of AI-based sharpening algorithm, I think you run the risk of, at that point you're seeing it screen res until it's very hard to know how that's going to end up. And ultimately you're to some extent surrendering control. Now, for some things, that's fine. And it will work well with some images, but I'm not convinced that it works with all. And I think that's pretty much what they're saying. I think.
Yeah, and I think what both magazines and an agent particularly will do when they receive images is they'll put the high-res one on the screen. They'll zoom it into 200, 400%,
yeah,
and just check there's a nice smooth grain without artifacts in.
Yeah.
And if you use these things, some of these stronger things, you will have artifacts at that level.
Yeah.
And yes, if you're going to print it at home, you probably won't see them.
Yeah.
But if it goes off to a client who does the same thing and sees the noise, they will often reject the images, and it reflects badly on the reputation of you as a photographer and the agents. Yeah. And that's why the agents don't want those pictures, because although for a lot of uses it will be absolutely fine, yeah, if one person moans about it and then their agency and you as a photographer get a reputation for poor image quality, that will harm you, how much your images are used.
Yeah. And
it only takes a few images like that can often stop a particular magazine or a particular publication wanting to use your work, because they're like, well, we had one of his or her pictures
and it didn't work,
fantastic,
yeah,
and then when we zoomed in on it, it looked awful,
yeah,
and we're now worried that all their pictures are like that. And for you, it was the one extreme image, but it can have a big effect.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to read. I think a little bit as well is that I think we're all obsessed with using these high resolution cameras. The library here talks about minimum image size, and they say that 3,000 pixels in the longest dimension is their minimum acceptable size, but that is actually a very small image.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That's half of the, well under half of a D850 file. So, yeah, just be aware that you don't necessarily, there's plenty of image use. And I think it's their way of saying you don't need to up-res your pictures all the time.
Yeah.
There's plenty of pictures of that size, 10, 15 years ago looked great on the covers of magazines. They still will now.
Yeah.
I remember Eric's famous, screaming turtle shot. That's an
Yeah.
amazing shot that's been on many magazine covers and still sells to this day.
Yeah.
Is a vertical crop out of a horizontal 6 megapixel Canon 20D file or some ridiculously old out of date camera.
Yeah.
It still sells and is used well, and that's much smaller size than this as an original.
Yeah, it's probably like 2.5 megapixels. So stupid.
It's longest dimension was 3,000 because it's a 3x2 file would be of 6 megapixels was 3,000 by 2,000 pixels.
Yeah.
And that's 1,500 pixels. Longest, something like that. Anyway, maybe less. So, but looks amazing on magazines to this day. And I don't know, Eric's printed it huge and it looks amazing. So, if it's a good, well shot picture on a low resolution camera, you don't need to use the up-resing software, and certainly from their point of view. Okay, just a couple of things is that they don't. One thing they ask for is don't. If you have one good file, choose your best crop for it and stick with that crop. Don't do like 2 or 3 different crops. If you've got a subject a bit small in the frame, you could crop a vertical and horizontal. They don't like that, and they remind you to, if you do crop, to mention it in the caption. It helps everyone. It's not going to get your picture out overruled. It's all about being honest, so that your user can trust what you've done. Everyone knows pictures need to be cropped. Everyone knows pictures need to be processed. It's about being honest through that process. Then they say their preferred color format is Adobe 1998 RGB, just because it's so industry wide. I know you can argue it's not the best color profile, and if you're doing pictures for yourself, you might want to use a different one, like but that's the industry standard, and that's what everyone is expecting files to be at. Then it just says, make sure you've inspected your files at 100% and make sure they're clean of sensor spots. They're not talking about every last speck of backscatter, but if the backscatter is a distraction, I think it's perfectly acceptable for stock images for it to be cleaned. And I would say particularly scuba magazines would expect it to be cleaned.
Absolutely.
The nature magazines are often actually maybe don't want it all cleaned, and but you don't really, as a photographer, want to be processing your images 2 different ways for different customers. So I think I tend to find a happy medium where I get rid of anything that's really annoying, but I don't expect my files to be perfect.
I think you touched on an interesting point there, though, Alex, and maybe a good way of kind of is I think that what we should be prepared to do is prepared to edit our images in different ways for different purposes, and I think that's really kind of the nub of what we're talking about here. So if you're preparing an image to post on social media, you do it one way. If you're preparing an image to post on to send out for publication, you post it another way. If you're preparing an image for a competition, obviously you've then got competition rules and so on and so forth. You've got so it would be quite. I think the mistake people make is they'll process an image once and that's the image, and you need to be prepared to actually process it in different ways for different purposes. And I think this is really one of the key things to kind of extract from this. If you're sending off your top 10 social media images to a stock house, you're probably not going to do very well with them. And I think your top 10 social media images reprocessed would do much better. I think that's what I'm saying.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, the way I approach it is I process it once to the publication level. And then from that, I'll make other, make social media versions. I tend not to make social media specials. I haven't got the time. I do badly enough trying to post pictures anyway. So you're not going to get the specially processed social media from me, sadly. I would say that as we've talked about before, I don't do any removal of anything from my pictures in Lightroom. Partly because I think the tools in Photoshop are better, but it also means that if I'm looking for a picture for a contest or for a magazine that's very strict on nothing being taken away from a picture, I know when I browse my Lightroom catalog, everything I'm looking at is as it was shot in terms of the content of the frame. And so that I don't go back and see a picture that I took 10 years ago and go, "Ooh, that looks amazing," and then realize that I've taken an annoying fish out the side of the frame, or I've done anything like that. So I very rarely crop my pictures in Lightroom. If I want to crop them, I'll crop them in Photoshop. So when I go back to that Lightroom catalog, I see that. It's also why I don't bring in to Lightroom my processed versions.
Yeah.
They live in a separate catalog or a separate place from my main raw file catalog.
Yeah.
So, and I think that helps you keep track of what you've done, because particularly as you shoot more, when you start out, you remember every photo and every last edit.
Yeah.
But I can assure you, when you take lots and lots of photos, you begin to. I remember the shooting very well of nearly everything I've ever shot, which is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of images.
Yeah.
And I remember the shooting of and processing of a lot of the people who come on my workshops pictures way better than them.
Yeah.
Because I'm properly engaged. People will show a picture and go, oh, I can't remember when I took this. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, you took that on this trip there, on that dive site there. And I remember you had this problem with this and we fixed it in processing. And they're like, oh, my God, how do you remember that? And I'm just like, I was concentrating, it's work, so I remember it.
It's also teaching. I think when you're explaining things to people, it often helps
your mind.
to fix things in your mind.
But yeah, that's why I do that. So yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting area, because I think it's something that's, until you're part of this system, no one tells you. And you learn by trial and error, and you send your first pictures into a magazine, and they're like, and your pictures are great, and they've won contests, and then they're like, they don't really work for us. We can't really print them, and you're like, what the hell am I doing wrong? And no one explains it to you. And it's because you sent it in the wrong color space and the wrong resolution, and you've over processed things, and you've not explained what you've done in captions, and all these little things that can trip you up and stop your pictures being used.
Yep. You want to load the deck in your favor. That's the trick. Thank you, Alex. It's a very interesting discussion. I know that you've recently been preparing videos of your images from trips with a narration about what you like about the processes. Where can people see those? Where are they best watching those?
I have a small YouTube channel, and I came up with doing this idea because I'm processing a lot of photos all the time for this very reason. And most of those pictures I don't feel are social media suitable. They're very they're very saleable underwater images, and they're very useful underwater images, but they're not always the kind of the wow shots you want to put on social media. And so I decided that rather than them just disappearing into the ether of maybe appearing in a book or a magazine or something in a few years' time, it was nice to talk about them when they were fresh and new, and I just process them, and I can talk about the content of the image. So usually at the end of the week on a Friday, I'll just open up my bridge on the computer with all the pictures in it that I've processed that week, and I'll just talk about them for 20 minutes or so. Often there's quite a lot of marine life chat in them, because that's what drives a lot of my photography, and I don't think that usually comes across when I give a photographic presentation. So it's a little bit different from hearing me talk about how a picture was made. I will sometimes talk a bit about technique, but I tend to talk a bit more about the content in that. And it's just a nice way of sharing images and hearing me speak without having to look at me as well. So it's just a screen recording. There's no banter like these.
So your YouTube channel is?
I have no idea. It's my name. It's not that commercial an entity, and I'd encourage people to follow Wetpixel Live first, because I think these are much more watchable. But if you really want a bit more extra detail and a chance to see images, I think that it's quite a nice place, and to see images that I don't share on social media.
I'll find the link to your channel and stick it in the show notes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure it's my name in some form or another.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Alex, and we'll see you soon. And thanks again to iColite for sponsoring this episode. We really appreciate our sponsor support. Please feel free to add comments and suggestions in the comments box, and drop us a like if you enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you again soon.